She wakes up at 7:30, 5 extra minutes in bed. Just 5, she tells herself. Breakfast is whatever comes in a wrapper because there's no time. On the way to work, she sends a voice message complaining about traffic. At lunch, she orders the most expensive item on the menu because she deserves it. By mid-afternoon, she dozes off at her desk and misses the deadline on a proposal she had been putting off for 3 days. That night, she lies down exhausted, staring at the ceiling, quietly wondering why life always feels so tight. She is not careless. She is not lazy. She simply never learned that there is an invisible architecture underneath everyday life, and that every small brick placed in the wrong spot quietly weakens the entire structure. Most people never see it. They look at their bank account and blame the economy. They look at their schedule and blame the demands of modern life. They look at their relationships and blame other people. But the real erosion is happening somewhere far more personal. It is happening in the small decisions that feel too minor to matter. The extra hour of sleep, the unnecessary purchase, the conversation that drained instead of built, the task left for tomorrow that never seems to come. Here is what is remarkable. Jesus addressed this long before anyone called it behavioral economics or habit psychology. He told stories about servants and seeds and soil and multiplication. He described with surgical precision the difference between the person who grows what they are given and the person who buries it out of fear, comfort, or distraction. And the consequences in those stories are not mild, they are absolute. What is not cultivated is taken away. What is not grown eventually disappears. That is not a threat. That is a description of how reality works. The gap between the life most people are living and the life they sense is possible is rarely about talent or opportunity. It is almost always about a set of quiet, repeated patterns that have become so normal they are invisible. Patterns around rest, appetite, speech, patience, and pleasure. Patterns that feel harmless individually but accumulate into a direction. And that direction, followed long enough, becomes a destination. What you are about to hear is not a list of rules. It is not a self-help script dressed in religious language. It is something far more grounded than that. It is a look at what wisdom literature, some of the oldest and most tested writing in human history, says about the specific habits that quietly produce scarcity and the specific shifts that begin to reverse it. You already have something in your hands. Everyone does. The question that changes everything is not how to get more. It is whether you are learning to multiply what is already there. That is the secret. And it has been hiding in plain sight for a very long time. You already know the feeling. Something catches your eye. A trip, a dinner, an upgrade, something you did not plan for but suddenly cannot stop thinking about. And then comes the thought that makes it feel reasonable. You have been working hard. You have been stressed. You deserve a break, a treat, a moment of relief. So you say yes. And it feels good for a little while. Nobody is saying that enjoyment is wrong. That is not the argument here. The problem is not pleasure itself. The problem is what happens when pleasure stops being something you choose and starts being something that chooses for you. When comfort becomes the loudest voice in the room. When the question you are really asking before most decisions is not, is this wise, but, will this feel good right now? Proverbs says it plainly, whoever loves pleasure will become poor. That sounds harsh until you trace the actual mechanism. It is not a punishment, it is a pattern. When feeling good in the present becomes your primary filter for decisions, the future slowly gets robbed to pay for it. Not all at once, gradually, a little from the savings, a little from the opportunity you were too comfortable to pursue, a little from the discipline you let go because you earned the rest. Each withdrawal feels small. The account empties anyway. Think about the parable of the talents. The servant who buried what he was given did not do it out of rebellion. He did it out of self-protection, out of a desire to avoid the discomfort of risk. Comfort and fear are closer than most people admit. The choice to stay where things are easy, to avoid the friction that growth requires, to prioritize what feels safe and pleasant over what demands effort, that is a form of burial. And Jesus was unambiguous about where it leads. Here is what makes this so difficult to see in real time. The things that quietly drain your financial future rarely feel like mistakes when you make them. They feel earned. They feel fair. They feel like balance. The lifestyle that is slightly beyond your means does not announce itself as a threat. It announces itself as a reward. And because it feels like a reward, questioning it feels ungrateful, even punishing. But there is a difference between enjoying what you have built and consuming what you have not yet earned. There is a difference between rest as restoration and comfort as avoidance. The person who learns to feel that difference, not just understand it intellectually, but actually feel it before the decision is made, is the person whose financial life begins to shift. The question is not whether you deserve good things. You do. The question is whether the version of good you are chasing today is quietly making the version of good you actually want tomorrow harder and harder to reach. That gap is where the work begins. There is a man most people would describe as gifted. He thinks quickly, connects ideas in ways others miss, and when he is fully present in a room, people notice. His colleagues respect him. His instincts are usually right. And yet, year after year, the results in his life do not match the potential everyone around him can clearly see. Projects stall, deadlines slip. Opportunities that seemed close somehow never close. He is talented enough to get in the door almost anywhere. He just cannot seem to stay long enough to build something real. What nobody talks about is what happens after lunch. It is not dramatic. He does not fall asleep at his desk or disappear for hours, but something shifts. The sharpness dulls. The ideas that came easily in the morning now require effort he does not have. He pushes through, technically present, but producing at a fraction of what he is capable of. By late afternoon, decisions that should take minutes take much longer, and the quality shows. Over weeks and months, this pattern compounds quietly into a career that never quite reaches what it should. The body is not separate from the mind. This is not a new idea. It is one of the oldest observations in wisdom literature. Proverbs groups gluttony and excessive drinking not as moral failures in isolation, but as patterns with direct economic consequences. The person who cannot govern appetite, who has no meaningful boundary between desire and consumption, tends to drift toward poverty. Not because of divine punishment, because of how the human system actually works. What you feed your body, how much you sleep beyond what restores, how consistently you override physical discipline in favor of immediate satisfaction. These things shape the cognitive environment in which every professional decision gets made. A mind operating inside an undisciplined body is a mind working against itself. The processing slows. The willpower that should be available for creative and financial decisions has already been spent managing the consequences of physical excess. There is also something deeper happening. The capacity for self-governance is not divided into separate compartments. The person who has learned to say no to the body in small things has trained a muscle that shows up everywhere else. The person who has never developed that muscle tends to find that impulse control is weak across the board, in spending, in commitment, in the follow-through that separates those who build from those who only begin. The man with the untapped potential is not failing because he lacks intelligence. He is failing because the physical patterns he has normalized are quietly capping what his mind can do. His ceiling is not his talent. It is his self-governance. And self-governance, unlike talent, is not something you are born with or without. It is something you build, one decision at a time, starting with the most ordinary moments of the day, long before anyone is watching and long before the stakes feel high enough to matter. I know the voice. I am not talking about laziness in the obvious sense, the kind that is easy to identify and dismiss as someone else's problem. I'm talking about something far more subtle and honestly far more dangerous, because it hides inside reasonable-sounding justifications. It speaks in the first person. It knows exactly what to say to sound fair. It starts in the morning, sometimes literally. The alarm goes off and something inside negotiates immediately. Just a few more minutes. You were up late. You worked hard yesterday. Your body needs this. And the thing is, none of that is entirely wrong, which is exactly what makes it so effective. The voice never suggests anything that sounds catastrophic. It only ever asks for a little more rest, a little more time before starting, a little more distance from the thing that requires effort or discomfort, or the kind of focus that does not come easily. Proverbs describes this with an accuracy that is almost uncomfortable. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty comes on you like a thief. What strikes me every time I read that is the repetition of the word little. The text is not describing someone who abandoned their responsibilities entirely. It is describing someone who made a series of small concessions, each one feeling reasonable in the moment, each one contributing to a direction that only becomes visible from a distance. I have lived this. There have been seasons where I was genuinely busy, genuinely productive in many areas, and still falling behind on the things that mattered most, not because I was doing nothing, but because I was always doing almost everything except the one thing that would have moved the needle. The procrastination in my life has rarely looked like paralysis. It has looked like busyness, organized avoidance, filling the hours with things that feel like progress while quietly deferring the decision, the project, the conversation, the commitment that actually carries weight. The cost of this is not always immediately visible. That is part of what makes it so persistent. If every act of delay came with an instant consequence, the pattern would break itself. But it does not work that way. The price gets transferred. Today's avoidance becomes tomorrow's emergency. The project that could have been built carefully over weeks gets rushed in hours. The financial decision that needed real thought gets made under pressure. The opportunity that required preparation disappears while I was waiting for the right moment, which never came because the right moment is almost always built, not found. There is something I have had to learn slowly and sometimes painfully. The feeling of not being ready is not a signal to wait. It is almost always a signal to begin. The clarity I was waiting for before starting rarely arrived before the work. It arrived inside the work. The motivation I thought needed to come first almost never preceded the action. It followed it. Waiting for conditions to be ideal before engaging is not wisdom. It is the voice of just a little more, dressed up in the language of patience and preparation. What I have come to understand is that time is the one resource that cannot be recovered. Money lost can be earned again. Relationships damaged can sometimes be restored. But the hour I handed over to delay is gone without negotiation. Every small concession to the voice that asks for just a little more rest, just a little more time, just a little more comfort before engaging, every one of those moments is a withdrawal from an account that does not offer refunds. The discipline of beginning, even imperfectly, even without feeling ready, is one of the most underestimated forms of financial and personal stewardship there is. You probably have never thought about your words as a financial instrument, but that is exactly what they are. Every conversation you have is a data point. People are quietly gathering information about who you are, how you process difficulty, whether you can be trusted with opportunity, whether being around you costs them energy or gives them something worth having. Nobody announces that they are doing this. It happens automatically beneath the surface of ordinary interaction, and the conclusions people reach shape what they offer you and what they withhold. Gossip feels low stakes in the moment. It is social, familiar, sometimes even bonding. But what it communicates to everyone within earshot is precise. This person does not protect what is shared with them. That single perception, once established, quietly closes doors you never even knew were open. The partnership that almost happened, the introduction that was almost made, the referral that went to someone else, you will never receive a memo explaining why. The opportunity simply will not arrive. Chronic complaint operates differently, but lands in the same place. There is a version of honest communication that identifies problems in order to solve them. That version is valuable. But the pattern of speaking about difficulty without movement, of returning again and again to what is wrong without any energy directed toward what could be built, that pattern signals something. It tells the people around you that your relationship with adversity is passive, and people who can offer you meaningful opportunities are almost always looking, consciously or not, for someone whose relationship with adversity is not passive. Proverbs says that whoever guards their mouth and tongue guards their soul from trouble. That word trouble in the original context carries weight beyond emotional distress. It includes the practical consequences that follow from a compromised reputation, from broken trust, from the slow accumulation of a social identity that repels what you actually want to attract. Your network is not just who you know, it is who still wants to know you after they have heard you speak for a while. Every word either builds that or erodes it. The return on learning to speak with intention, to protect others with your silence, to direct your energy towards solutions rather than grievances. That return does not show up in a single transaction. It compounds, quietly and consistently, in ways that eventually become impossible to ignore. There is a particular kind of loss that nobody talks about honestly. It is not the loss that comes from a bad investment or a failed business. It is the loss that comes from abandoning a good process too early because it was not moving fast enough. The person who stops planting because the ground has not produced yet. The person who walks away from something that was actually working because working slowly felt the same as not working at all. Every generation gets its own version of the shortcut, the scheme that promises the result without the process, the method that claims to compress years into weeks, the opportunity that requires urgency precisely because urgency prevents the kind of thinking that would reveal its flaws. And every generation loses the same way, not because the people who fall for these things are foolish, but because the promise of speed is genuinely difficult to resist when the alternative is patient, unglamorous, daily effort with no guaranteed timeline. Proverbs is direct about this. Careful planning leads to profit, but hasty action leads to poverty. That is not a warning against ambition. It is a description of mechanism. Speed applied without foundation does not accelerate growth. It accelerates collapse. The thing that was not built properly fails faster under pressure, not slower. The parable of the talents contains something that is easy to miss. The servants who multiplied what they were given did not find a faster field or a better seed. They worked what was in their hands, within the time they had, without any indication that the master was returning soon. They did not know the timeline. They simply stayed faithful to the process, and when the accounting came, the multiplication was already done. It had happened gradually, invisibly, through the accumulation of days that probably felt ordinary while they were living them. This is the pattern that the noise of modern life works hardest against. The algorithm rewards what is immediate and dramatic. The market celebrates what explodes overnight. But underneath every story of sudden success, when examined honestly, there is almost always a long and quiet season of preparation that made the explosion possible. The overnight success is almost always a decade in the making, seen only from the outside, at the moment it finally became impossible to ignore. What you are building slowly is not falling behind. It is becoming real. I want to be honest with you about something. Getting to this point in a conversation like this one is not as common as it should be. Most people encounter an idea that challenges a pattern they recognize in themselves, and they move on before anything changes. Not because they do not care, but because caring and changing are two very different things, and the distance between them is almost always crossed by a single concrete act, not by continued reflection. So here is the one thing I want you to do before this day is over. Not a system, not a 5-step plan, not a spreadsheet or a restructured morning routine. One thing: ask for wisdom. Not as a religious formality, not as a phrase you repeat without weight, but as a genuine and humble acknowledgement that the patterns we talked about today, comfort, appetite, delay, words, impatience, are not problems you can think your way out of entirely on your own. They are deep. They are old. They are woven into habits that took years to form and will require something beyond willpower alone to consistently interrupt. James says that if anyone lacks wisdom, they should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault. That phrase, without finding fault, is the part I keep coming back to. It means the starting point does not matter. The history does not disqualify you. The number of times you have recognized this same pattern and still returned to it does not close the door. The wisdom is available, and the only condition is that you ask. Tonight, before you sleep, write down 3 honest questions about what you heard today, not conclusions. Not commitments you are not sure you can keep, just questions. Where am I burying what I have been given? Where is comfort costing me more than I have been willing to admit? Where is my speech closing doors I do not even know exist? Where am I moving fast in a direction that has no real foundation? Write the questions, then ask, quietly and without performance, for the wisdom to answer them over time. What begins there is not a feeling, it is not a burst of motivation that fades by the weekend. What begins there is an orientation, a direction, and direction, sustained long enough with small daily faithfulness, becomes the only thing that was ever needed to multiply what you already have. The talent is already in your hands. It has been there the whole time.